Amidst a blizzard, in the rear of an abandoned cottage, there was movement. It wasn't human, nor a vehicle, but rather a canine, tethered so restrictively that its coat was encased in ice against the metal chain. Unidentified, without protection, only the harsh frost and quietude surrounded it. What kind of individual would abandon a German shepherd to perish in these conditions? And what explains the expression in its gaze, suggesting an extended vigil for an arrival? The ensuing narrative extends considerably beyond a mere rescue. It concerns mysteries concealed by ice, justice long overlooked, and the enduring connection between a woman and a canine determined not to fade from memory. The winters in Montana are unforgiving. They inflict a harsh toll, particularly in the remote woodlands frequented only by those disoriented or fleeing. Deep within these frigid woods, near a dilapidated cabin engulfed by vegetation, a form remained so motionless it seemed to blend with the landscape. A German shepherd, little more than skin and bone, was tethered to an ice-encrusted pole. Its coat had hardened into sharp, icy points, and each breath dissipated into the breeze as if attempting to break the stillness on its behalf. It made no sound, no barks, no whimpers, no commotion typical of a dog in distress. It was merely waiting. And that quietness resonated more profoundly than any lament. The cabin had been uninhabited for more than 10 years. Its roof drooped as if in defeat, the porch was fractured, and the windows were obscured by accumulated snow and decay. The one who abandoned it there clearly intended for it to remain undiscovered. Nevertheless, an unknown individual had provided just enough sustenance for it to survive, not flourish, not recover, but simply to subsist, a breathing enigma. What reason could there be for leaving a German shepherd tethered in such isolation? Unless there was a secret to conceal. No animal tracks or vehicle marks were visible in the snow, only the dog and an unusual design at the foot of the adjacent tree. A circular impression was etched in the snow, suggesting someone had walked repetitively in a circle before disappearing. Yet, that was not the most peculiar detail. Upon closer inspection, markings were evident on the tree bark, not natural, not accidental. Faint but intentional letters formed a single name, Frost. Beneath it, a prominent gash resembling a line drawn under a signature. Who would give a name to a tree? And this canine was no mere stray left out in the freezing temperatures. It wore no collar, but its eyes held something incongruous with its emaciated frame. Its stare was intense, weighty, and unnervingly calm, not the calmness of terror, but the calmness of anticipation. Anticipating what, however? An individual, a reappearance, a moment of retribution. Those woods harbored tales, the sort that prompted townspeople to shift conversations when mentioned. There were stories of disappearances, whispers of rumors. A youth had vanished years prior with his canine companion. A man had disappeared shortly after attempting to purchase the property where the cabin stood. Locals attributed these events to misfortune or severe weather. This German shepherd, however, was the sole remaining link to that history. It was unaware of its connection to a mystery. It only knew the pain of the chain, the inconsistency of meals, and the increasing toll of the nightly cold. Yet, it continued to wait, for someone had once pledged to return, and this was a dog that held onto promises. Eleanor Briggs was not a woman easily perturbed. At 60 years of age, with eyes like iron and hands that still moved with the practiced grace of one who knew how to preserve life and rescue it from peril, she had witnessed a great deal. Runaways, discarded litters, dogs neglected in basements like damaged implements, she had seen the gamut. Yet, something about this particular morning felt amiss. The call arrived at 6:17 a.m. A blocked number, an unsteady voice, delivering a single sentence. There's a dog chained behind the old bramble cabin. He won't last long. Then a click. No identification, no possibility of a return call. Just a visceral shock enveloped in the morning chill. The name Bramble caused her to pause mid-sip of her acrid gas station coffee. That location hadn't been mentioned in years. The last time she recalled hearing it, it was connected to a missing boys case. Wyatt Hale had disappeared 10 winters ago. He was last seen near that cabin with his German shepherd, Ranger. The search had persisted for months, yielding no clues. Eventually, snow blanketed the woods and silence enveloped the town. But there she was, maneuvering herself into her aged pickup truck, a blanket tucked behind the seat, a thermos of coffee rattling on the dashboard. The road was a jarring stretch of snow and ice, barely discernible in some areas. Her headlights sliced through the white expanse like ineffective blades. Trees loomed as if straining to overhear. The Bramble cabin no longer appeared on GPS systems that indicated how much time had passed. She had to rely on memory and intuition. As she reached the crest of the final incline, the cabin emerged like an artifact exhumed from the past. The same misshapen roof, the same darkened window panes. And there, against the post at the rear, was the figure, still, icy, and watchful. He did not stir when she parked. He did not flinch when she exited her vehicle and crunched towards him through snow that came up to her shins. He simply observed her. His eyes were not wide with fear, but narrowed and fixed as if he were scrutinizing her very soul. No growl, no whimper, just a cold gaze that seemed to convey, "You're late." She knelt without uttering a word. Up close, the extent of the damage was more apparent. The chain had abraded his neck until it was raw. His paws were cracked and bleeding. His fur was matted with clumps of ice near his haunches. She whispered almost inaudibly, uncertain why, "Hey boy, I've got you." Still, he remained motionless. Not recoiling, not approaching, merely enduring. Then her gaze fell upon it, the carving in the pine tree. Frost. Beneath it, a mark resembling a claw or knife drag. The bark had aged around it, turning gray at the edges. Old, deliberate. She had seen that name once before, in a case file. Wyatt had nicknamed his dog Frost because of the way he blended into the snow. But this was not Ranger. This dog was younger, thinner, yet strangely familiar. The eyes, the posture. Could it be Ranger's offspring? She dismissed the thought. Not now. The chain resisted her efforts. It was rusted, thick, and bolted into the post. She pulled until the metal groaned and finally yielded. The shepherd still did not rise. She enveloped him in the old Ranger blanket, one her husband had used before cancer claimed him. It still carried a faint scent of cedar and gasoline. As she lifted the dog into her arms, she sensed something else, a flicker like a heartbeat beneath the frost. The journey back to the clinic felt protracted. He barely stirred. She continually glanced in the rearview mirror, verifying if he was still breathing. Each time, those eyes met hers, silent, a witness to something she did not yet comprehend. Back in town, the veterinary clinic was quiet beneath overcast skies. Dr. Mason Keller opened the door, dressed in flannel and jeans, yawning until he saw her expression and the burden in her arms. He stopped abruptly. "Eleanor, is that?" She placed the shepherd on the examination table. No chip, no collar. Found chained behind bramble. His fingers hovered above the fur as if he were touching a phantom. "He looks just like." "Don't say it," she whispered. But they were both entertaining the same thought. And when they scanned for a microchip against all expectations, there was a match, a dormant registration. No name, just a code link to case number 271. Status, confidential. Then Mason's expression altered. He recoiled as if he had touched something scorching. "Eleanor." That was Wyatt's case. For a small-town clinic, the atmosphere suddenly felt palpably denser. Eleanor stood immobile, one hand still resting on the dog's flank, while Mason stared at the computer screen as though it had just communicated. He said nothing initially, just scrolled, clicked, and scrolled once more. The code associated with the microchip wasn't merely old. It had been sealed. That was a circumstance neither of them had encountered before. It didn't list a name, an owner, or any veterinary history, only a prominent red flag. Case number 271. Confidential. Case number 271. The type of number that didn't appear in routine neglect cases or standard pet records. That number belonged to narratives the town endeavored to forget. Eleanor's heart began to race. She stepped back, retrieved her phone, and opened her notes application. In a folder labeled Unsolved, she had saved an old newspaper clipping from a decade prior. She located the name. Wyatt Hale, 17 years old, vanished without a trace. Last seen hiking the northern trails near Bramble Creek with his German shepherd, Ranger. A dog that possessed the same intelligent brow, the same slightly torn ear, the same silent fortitude that now lay shivering on her examination table. But it couldn't be. That was 10 years ago. Dogs didn't live that long, and this one was no senior. Young, yes, but weathered, lean like an athlete. Scars beneath its fur suggested prolonged exposure, possibly mistreatment. Yet, there was an uncanny familiarity in the way it surveyed the room. It didn't flinch at the metallic sounds of veterinary instruments. It didn't panic at the cold stethoscope. It didn't even resist when Mason inserted the 4. It was as if it had experienced all this previously and had silently resolved to endure it once more. Mason gently bandaged the dog's leg, shaking his head. "If he's connected to Wyatt's case, we'll need to notify someone. But this doesn't feel random. Someone wanted this dog off the map." The realization struck Eleanor with force. He hadn't been abandoned like the others. He had been deliberately placed, isolated, concealed. Back at her home, that theory refused to dissipate. She poured herself some tea, allowed it to cool, and finally succumbed to the persistent urge. She ascended to the attic, where her late husband had stored old ranger files and personal records. Dust motes danced in the beam of her flashlight. It took 30 minutes before she located it. An old, weathered box labeled Bramble. Inside were maps, annotated reports, and a manila folder titled Confidential Witness. Wyatt Hale. Tucked within that folder was a photograph. A teenage boy smiling beside a dog. Eleanor's stomach lurched. The dog in the photo, same deep eyes, same torn ear. But this was Ranger. Larger, with a slightly different build, but unmistakably him. The resemblance between him and the shepherd at the clinic was more than mere coincidence. It was a blood connection. At the clinic the following morning, she opened the door gently. The dog, whom Mason had nicknamed Shadow due to his near-silent demeanor, was awake, sitting upright, eyes alert, fixed on her the instant she entered. There was no tail wag, no bark, no eager approach. But he did something else, something that deeply affected her. He took one slow step forward and pressed his head softly into her hand. It was the first occasion he had permitted anyone to touch him without resistance. Mason entered quietly, holding a chart. His vitals are stabilizing, but the exposure took a toll. He needs rest, time, and someone to stay close. She did not hesitate. "I'll stay." And just like that, the chain that once bound him to a post in the snow was gone. But a new one had formed, quiet, invisible, and stronger than any steel. And someone, somewhere, was about to discover that Shadow hadn't been left behind. He had survived. And now he was not alone. Something was buried in Bramble. And it wasn't merely the past. Eleanor returns to the woods, and her findings will blow this case wide open. Eleanor had never believed in phantoms, but that cabin possessed a quality that made her reconsider. The next morning, after spending the night beside Shadow at the clinic, her coat crumpled into a makeshift pillow and the hum of machinery blending with the quiet rhythm of his breathing, she drove back to Bramble. Something felt unsettled. The microchip, the eyes, that barkless entreaty for help. And most significantly, the name carved into the pine tree, Frost. The snowfall was gentler now, as if the forest were holding its breath. Every branch shimmered under a coating of ice, and Eleanor's boots sank deep into the white expanse as she retraced her steps to the location. The chain was absent. The post, split and barely standing, leaned as if eroded by time, but it was the bark that captivated her. She ran her fingers over the name once more. It wasn't hastily scratched. It was etched with care, almost with reverence. Below it, that peculiar line, a claw mark or perhaps something else. She circled the perimeter of the cabin. That's when she observed them. Footprints. A single set, recent, encircled the fence where Shadow had been tethered. Not animal tracks, not boots caked with snow, but deliberate, pressed deeply into the frost and then disappearing behind a declivity of trees. Whoever had been here had returned, and they were observing. Following the trail, Eleanor found herself stepping over logs and ducking under limbs until something crunched beneath her boot. Plastic. She looked down and uncovered what appeared to be a torn Ziploc bag, weathered but intact. Inside was a photograph, wrinkled, water-stained, but clear enough. Wyatt Hale standing beside a younger ranger, both beaming. Behind them, the Bramble cabin before it fell into disrepair. The same crooked porch, the same treeline. But taped to the back was something more ominous. A single word written in smudged red ink, snitched. Her stomach tightened. This wasn't about a missing dog or even a lost boy. This was about someone silencing the past and using Shadow to bury the truth. She returned to the truck, gripping the photo as if it might disintegrate in her hand. Back at the clinic, Shadow was awake. No for drip, just curled in the corner of the room, tail tucked but ears alert. He didn't growl when she entered, just watched, as if he had known she would return. Eleanor knelt. "Do you know what happened out there?" she whispered. No bark, but a twitch of his ear, a slow blink. She reached out, this time with more assurance. He allowed her to scratch behind his ear, only for a moment, but that moment felt like a year of trust established in a single breath. Mason stepped in. "He's healing faster than expected," he remarked, glancing at Shadow. "But there's something else." His blood work showed something odd. He's been sedated repeatedly. Tranquilizers, the same kind used on K9s, or animals you don't want running away. That's when it all connected. Someone had been keeping this dog hidden. Not lost, not abandoned, controlled. Just enough food to survive, sedated to remain calm, tied up when the risk of discovery grew too high. But why now? Why bring him back here? The phone rang. Eleanor answered reflexively. Silence. Then a raspy voice filtered through static. "You should have left him." The line went dead. Mason looked at her. "You okay?" She hung up and grabbed her keys. "We're not done." Whatever this was, it was larger than an old case. Someone still wanted it to remain closed. And Shadow, he wasn't just the final piece. He was the key. Next up, Eleanor's fight for truth intensifies. But not everyone desires her investigation. The danger escalates and someone attempts to enforce silence. Some dogs forget. They wag their tails and move forward. But some remember profoundly, the kind of recollection that stays in their very bones, that echoes in their quietness. Shadow was that type of dog. And the more Eleanor investigated, the more she understood this was not merely a rescue. It was a recovery, a gradual, painful unearthing of something that had been concealed for too long. But if you dig deeply enough in snow, you don't just find truth. You awaken things best left undisturbed. That morning, Eleanor did not go to her usual work. She returned to Bramble. Snow had fallen again during the night, creating a clean surface, but even purity has its imperfections. There, around the fence post, were fresh footprints, human. Just one set, pacing tightly in circles, then vanishing into the woods behind the cabin. No vehicle tracks, no animal prints, just an ethereal trail leading nowhere. Whoever had left that dog had not disappeared. They had come back, and they were watching. She followed the tracks until they merged into a small depression in the terrain. A half-frozen log. Behind it, buried in loose pine needles and ice, something protruded, plastic sheeting, curled at the edges. Eleanor pulled it free. Inside, damp but discernible, was another photograph. Wyatt Hale again, smiling, a teenage boy with hopeful eyes. And there beside him a young German shepherd, not Shadow, but with almost the same eyes, the same white blaze above the nose. It was Ranger, the dog who had vanished with him. And taped to the back of the photo was a torn scrap of paper with a single word scribbled in blocky ink, "Witness." A cold dread coiled in her stomach. This was no longer about a missing boy. This was about silencing something or someone who had seen too much. And suddenly Eleanor felt like a target. Back at the clinic, Shadow was stronger. Still limping, still quiet, but his eyes were sharper. He tracked her every movement. When she approached, he stood, wobbly, slow, but upright, as if he sensed the gravity of the moment. Mason watched in quiet admiration. "He's healing fast," he said. "But I've never seen a dog respond like this. It's like he knows you saved him." Eleanor nodded, half distracted. Her phone buzzed. "No caller ID." She answered. Static. Then a voice, deep and composed, "Stop looking. He was never meant to be found." Click. She didn't even flinch. Just stared at the phone for a moment, then dropped it into her coat pocket as if it were just another empty threat. But inside, her thoughts raced. If they were watching her, it meant they knew she had the dog, which meant they were becoming desperate. And desperate people make mistakes. She sat beside Shadow, his head resting on her boot. Her fingers traced the scars along his back. She didn't want to imagine the stories behind them. His ears twitched at the sound of the wind outside. The world may have forgotten him, but his body remembered everything. Later that afternoon, Eleanor visited her niece, Katie, a freelance journalist who had grown up idolizing the story of Wyatt Hale. Katie had once attempted to revive interest in the case during her college years, but was dismissed as a conspiracy theorist. She listened now with a fire in her eyes. "You're telling me you found Wyatt's dog's offspring? That someone brought it back to Bramble after 10 years? That it's microchipped to a sealed case file?" Eleanor laid the photo down. And this was left buried, along with a threat. Katie scanned the photo. "Do you know who Witness refers to? Could be Wyatt. Could be Ranger. Could be whoever this dog saw." Katie grinned, the kind of grin that signals impending trouble. If someone's trying to shut you up, it means you're onto something. That night, as the clinic closed and Eleanor rested on a fold-out cot beside Shadow's crate, a crash shattered the silence, the sound of breaking glass. The front window of her truck had been smashed. A brick lay on the passenger seat. No note, just a message carved into the brick's surface: end this or next time it's fire. Shadow didn't bark, but he didn't sleep either, and neither did Eleanor. By the time morning arrived, the temperature had plunged 20 degrees. A blizzard loomed on the horizon, but the true tempest had already commenced, not in the sky, but within Eleanor's heart. And Shadow, he paced now, stiffly but with focus, like a seasoned soldier awaiting a signal. Whatever this was, he could sense its approach. The tension in the air needed no words, it resided in instinct, and instinct was something neither of them had ever lost. Katie was already at the diner when Eleanor slid into the booth, her fingers trembling from more than just the chill. She placed the photo and the brick on the table like pieces of evidence in a courtroom. Katie examined both in silence, then looked up, her expression taut. "You're being followed," she stated, as if it were an established fact, not a supposition. Eleanor nodded. "And warned." Katie didn't flinch. "Perfect. That means they're nervous." The Hale case had been dormant for a decade. But Katie had never ceased her inquiries. She slid her laptop across the table and opened a file, a scanned report she had once illicitly obtained from a city archive. Wyatt Hale filed a complaint 2 weeks before his disappearance. Said he had proof of illegal dumping on forest land. A name came up: Reed Donner, land developer, owned half of Bramble's bordering property. But the file got buried fast. Why? Eleanor asked, though she already sensed the answer. Donner's company funds 3 council members, has compromising information on the sheriff, and fun twist, he's running for state senate next fall. Of course he is, Eleanor murmured. Katie leaned forward. He was under investigation for illegal chemical dumping. Wyatt found something. He and Ranger. She paused, correcting herself. Shadow's father. They went out there one night. Wyatt never came back. And Ranger, maybe he did, Eleanor said softly, her eyes already welling up. Just not the way we thought. The ensuing silence spoke volumes. If this was true, if Donner or someone in his employ had left Wyatt for dead and attempted to eliminate the only witness, his dog, then Shadow wasn't just a survivor. He was a menace. That night, the wind intensified, howling through the crevices in Eleanor's windows. Snow fell sideways, blindingly, and amidst it all, the clinic lights flickered. Then darkness, a blackout. She hurried to the back, flashlight in hand, to check on Shadow. The emergency generator hadn't activated. Shadow lay still, not unconscious, but staring at a corner of the room as if something had entered that she couldn't perceive. And then fire, a flash of orange outside the window. The storage shed was engulfed in flames. Flames leaped high, hot, and swift as if they had been awaiting an opportunity. Eleanor ran out into the cold, doused what she could with a frozen hose, coughing, her eyes watering. It wasn't just storage, it was where she kept her Ranger files, the original Bramble case notes, the copies of Wyatt's photo, everything that wasn't already on Katie's laptop was gone. But not everything inside. Shadow had moved, limped slowly to the scorched edge of the room. And resting near his paw was something Eleanor didn't recall seeing before, a metal tag. Ranger's tag, faded and scratched, but still legible. It must have fallen from the box she'd brought from the attic days earlier. Or he'd found it, pulled it out, protected it as if he understood its significance, as if it were the only piece of his father he still possessed. By morning, word had spread. The local paper ran a small item: fire destroys clinic shed, cause unknown. But Katie was already a step ahead. She published a blog post on an independent website, complete with photos of the bricks, the tag, the burnt records, and a name: Reed Donner. The post went viral by afternoon. Shadow's photo, wrapped in the Ranger blanket, eyes sharp, scars visible, circulated like wildfire. People didn't just see a dog, they saw a symbol of survival, of silence broken. And Reed Donner, he released a bland public statement. But by midnight, an unmarked car parked 2 blocks from Eleanor's house. The man inside never exited. Just sat there, waiting. By the time the sun crested Bramble Ridge, the snow had started to thaw, but the truth was just beginning to solidify. Shadow lay curled in the center of the exam room, partly limp, partly alert, like a soldier recuperating mid-conflict. Eleanor sat beside him, a thermos in one hand, the Ranger file in the other, every page still carrying the faint odor of burnt paper and adrenaline. Her fingers trembled slightly, not from age or cold, but from what she was about to undertake. Katie's article had achieved viral status. The dog with the scarred face and the 1,000-yard stare had become a symbol, the witness left behind. It had been barely 12 hours since its publication, but the story had already reached state reporters. A larger news outlet picked it up, then another. Then someone called from a national network requesting an interview. People weren't merely intrigued, they were incensed. They perceived in Shadow something universally human, pain endured in silence, loyalty outlasting time, and injustice left to fester until someone dared to bring it into the light. And at that moment, that someone was Eleanor. But before she could fully process the weight of that attention, the sheriff arrived. Literally, the same man who had dismissed her weeks ago, the same man who had closed Wyatt's case with a shrug. Now he stood in the lobby, hat in hand, his cheeks flushed from either the cold or guilt. "We've reopened Hale's file," he stated. "Too much noise, too many eyes on it now." "Oh, you mean the public did your job for you?" Katie interjected from behind the desk. He ignored her. "We'll need to take the dog in as evidence." Eleanor's reply wasn't loud, but it was sharp enough to slice through the tension like a scalpel. "You'll have to take me first." A pause. Then Mason emerged from the back room, surgical gloves still on. "You try taking that dog, Sheriff, and you'll be in the next article." That marked the end of that particular conversation. Back in the exam room, Shadow stirred. Eleanor sat by him, placing the tag, Ranger's tag, on the ground. He sniffed it, then gently laid his paw over it as if protecting something sacred. No one had taught him that. It was something deeper, generational, and instinct passed down not in words, but in profound understanding. That night, the storm outside abated, but inside the clinic, things began to shift. Shadow walked slowly, carefully, toward the front door and stood there, staring, waiting. Eleanor opened it. He stepped out into the snow unchained for the first time. He limped a few feet into the yard and sat. The moon cast everything in a soft, silvery light. Then, as if guided by some internal compass, he turned his gaze toward the woods, the very woods where he had been chained. Eleanor followed his eyes. No sound, no footsteps, but she knew it, someone was watching again. Katie arrived minutes later, laptop in hand, her face pale. Donner's campaign manager just resigned. Whistleblower statement. He confessed. Said Donner paid off deputies to shut down the investigation after Wyatt disappeared. He admitted Donner was on the trail that night. Eleanor barely blinked. And Wyatt? Katie hesitated. Still no body, but they're sending forensic teams to Bramble next week. Shadow didn't move, just watched the trees. And then he barked just once. Short, sharp, purposeful. It was the first sound he had made since the rescue. A declaration. The past wasn't buried, it was alive. It didn't transpire in a courtroom. There were no television cameras, no gavels striking down with theatrical emphasis. The justice that unfolded over the subsequent weeks was more subdued than that. Quiet, yet relentless. Reed Donner's name, once emblazoned across campaign signs and fundraiser banners, now appeared in headlines alongside words like indictment, evidence tampering, and cover-up. The brick he had metaphorically hurled at Shadow had ricocheted, striking back with the force of a decade of silence finally erupting into truth. Search teams returned to Bramble, this time equipped with cadaver dogs, thermal drones, and a narrative to which the public demanded answers. They discovered what Eleanor had suspected but never voiced: remnants of a shallow grave, clothing fibers matched to Wyatt Hale, fragments of what was once a teenage boy's world, frozen in time. The case, once dismissed as a local legend, became the impetus for statewide reform. But this story, Shadow's story, didn't conclude in courtrooms or archives. It concluded in a cabin. Eleanor stood on the same snow-covered ground where Shadow had once been tethered. But this time, the chain was gone. In its place, a simple wooden post stood tall and pristine. A plaque was fastened to it, in memory of Wyatt Hale. In honor of Ranger and his son, Shadow. Shadow was beside her, enveloped in a soft blue flannel coat, one of Mason's old shirts that Eleanor had repurposed. His limp persisted, but his eyes burned with something new. Not fear, not pain, but peace. A kind of quiet that only arrives after the storm has subsided. Katie, camera in hand, documented every moment. Not for online engagement. Not for viewership, but because stories like this were infrequent. The kind that reminded people why truth mattered, why loyalty was more than just a word, and why some dogs somehow carry the weight of memory longer than most humans can endure. Mason arrived carrying a small wooden box. Inside were the ashes of the original Ranger tag and some of the scorched records lost in the shed fire. Eleanor accepted them wordlessly and buried the box beneath the pine where frost was carved. Shadow sat beside her throughout the entire process, unmoving, as if he comprehended the gravity of what was being laid to rest. Later that evening, she brought him home, not just for a visit, but to stay. His crate was replaced with a soft bed by the fireplace. Toys accumulated over the past few weeks were scattered like confetti from a celebration they never formally announced. And on the mantel, a photo sat in a new frame, Wyatt, Ranger, and now a photo of Shadow standing in the snow, head high, tail raised. He didn't bark much, but he didn't need to. In his silence, there was legacy. In his scars, there was survival. And in his new name, Shadow, there was transformation. As snow began to fall outside the cabin once again, Eleanor stepped out onto the porch with a cup of coffee and looked over the field. Shadow followed, sitting beside her as if this had always been his home. No fireworks, no headlines, just two survivors side by side, finally free. And somewhere in the quiet woods behind them, a name carved into bark still watched over it all.